Welcome to Delivering Knowledge, our non-commercial initiative to gather and share expertise and insights from professionals within our constantly changing industry. In November 2024, we were joined by Gavin Wadsworth. Gavin's a pharmaceutical, medical device and biotech consultant with almost 25 years' experience in technical, quality, specialist and management roles. For Delivering Knowledge, Gavin shared his expertise regarding airflow visualization.
I am the founder and owner of Wadsworth Qualifications Limited. I've been working in the pharma, the biotech industry for over nearly 25 years now, should I say. I'm originally a graduate of pharmaceutical sciences from De Montfort University, and I hail from Nottingham. My background is that over those sort of 25 years, I've worked in numerous positions from microbiology to engineering to a problem solver, troubleshooter. So it's given me a good background, I think, to talk about what I'm going to talk about today, which is airflow visualization, often referred to as smoke visualization as well. Really, it's the ultimate way of being able to analyze or to visualize something that, to all intents and purposes, is invisible. We don't know what physically is in the air around us, but I can assure you that there are a multitude of things, either viable and living, or non-viable, as we term it. So, there are hundreds of thousands of particles floating around in the air that you and I can't necessarily see, which for the pharma industry and in a clean room environment is not something we want, and it's certainly not something we want going into our products or into patients that are taking those products themselves. So what we're really trying to do through airflow visualization is actually do as it says. We're trying to visualize that, we're trying to see where the air currents and the flow patterns are actually going, to make sure we're very much getting that cleaning, that flushing effect in our rooms, in our equipment, to ensure that contamination is controlled or minimized, or hopefully really eliminated at the end of the day. The problems with airflow visualization, so or more visualizing it kind of in the first place, I've just said that it is very much invisible, it is transparent. So what can we do to visualize it kind of in the first place? So we very much kind of rely on what I would term our organoleptic properties, sight, sound, smell, those things. And with airflow visualization, we're very much relying upon the sight, the visualization element of it. In order for us to do that, we've got to introduce smoke. In this case, we've got to introduce an element that allows us to visualize what those air patterns are actually doing in the first place. Now, back in the dim and distant past, there was something called Schlerin imaging that was originally sort of first used. That used a fixed light source, a mirror, and we introduced the kind of the object or the area of concern in between, and depending on how much light was deflected or diffracted, we could see what the air currents were doing. Now, it's great as a technique, but in clean room environments where we're constantly wanting to look around a whole room or a whole environment to understand what is going on, that wouldn't work. So we're driven down the route of having things that are a bit more portable, being able to actually move those around. So we look to things like smoke generators, but not all smoke generators are the same. So they can use a variety of different mediums to actually introduce that smoke. They all principally work around the same way, that you're using a chemical source and vaporizing that to produce some smoke. Now what you ideally want is you want that smoke to be nice and buoyant and floating and actually not just drift down, because then that gives a false representation of what the air currents are actually doing in the first place. So we very much tend to use a propylene glycol based smoke fluid, often mixed with water. That will get vaporized and it can be jettisoned kind of out of various smoke distribution apparatus, and then the airflow kind of picks up. It does the rest, if you like. We, as or myself as kind of someone that will carry out this testing or actually review it. There's an element of how we kind of set up and we plan for that as well. So naturally we can't just kind of point smoke in the direction of interest. We have to be showing or let the air do the work in this case. So, you know, pointing smoke towards a door, for example, doesn't necessarily show what we're kind of looking for. Showing that we've actually maintaining the integrity and kind of isolator is another example I would use. We want to have it perpendicular, I think is probably a key word I would use. So despite where the airflow is going, we don't have the smoke going in the same direction as that. We very much can have it side on at a 90-degree angle to very much show that that airflow is doing the work and it's not the smoke in this instance. We're always interested in both the equipment and the chemical that we're actually using in the first place, but we're also interested in kind of the size of the smoke or the size of the particulates that we're kind of generating whilst we're doing that testing. The reason this is kind of so important is because it makes that difference between the smoke actually floating and actually moving down by gravity kind of in the first place. We want it to be buoyant. We want the smoke to hang around for a while rather than kind of dissipating straight away, which is why I'm kind of saying that using the right equipment, using the right materials and the right smoke distribution system are really kind of key to doing that. So we're generally looking in the region of around sort of 0.3 to 0.5 micron for sort of our smoke particulate size. That's generally referred to as like a tracer method is what we use and what most smoke equipment is generally based on these days for actually carrying out the testing. For smoke visualization in general and for the tracer method that I've just described, the key takeaways I kind of want to give to people are: make sure you've got the right equipment, make sure that the smoke medium that you're using, that chemical element is neutrally buoyant, is in that particle range that I've talked about, so that 0.3, that 0.5 micron size. And make sure it's stable, make sure it's hanging around long enough for you to actually be able to visualize what's going on in your environment in the first place, whether that's your clean room or a micro safety cabinet or an isolator or a barrier system, whatever it may be. The video will only look as good as the equipment and the smoke medium that you're using in the first place. For airflow visualization studies, we notice I've added an S onto there now. Really, what we're looking for, it's the science of actually bringing all those elements together, and the science of actually producing a study for you to get that knowledge out of it as to what's happening in the environment you're looking at in the first place. So what sort of things are we looking for? Well, we're obviously looking for kind of static areas or spots where kind of the air is slow to move or slow to kind of dissipate, but we're also looking on the flip side of that. So it could be overly turbulent air or eddies is another thing. We're obviously looking to make sure that the air is moving in the right direction. A lot of clean room environments or you know, equipment in general tends to be a barrier to humans or to contamination in general, and we normally classify it in that way. So often, you know, what we might term as kind of our aseptic core or a grade A environment, we want to keep very much separated from those dirtier environments, those kind of grade B, C, D, and the unclassified, the outside world. So we're very much making sure that the air is flowing in the right direction, that we're not getting dirty air flowing into a clean environment, and that it's going the other way effectively. We're also looking for things like unidirectional airflow as well and laminar flow. So we're looking for a particular type of flow to be displayed by the smoke as it's actually coming through. And all of those things allow us to understand what's going on in the environment, and if we're actually getting the right movement of smoke, and if we're not, what we're going to do about it, whether that be monitoring or some sort of change to the design of our facility, or even our heating, ventilation and air conditioning itself. There are a lot of guidelines, regulations around airflow visualization, around smoke visualization, believe it or not. And I think a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding by people is that this is only a recent thing since the new Annex 1 was brought about in 2022. It's actually not. It's been around for decades in various shapes and forms. The FDA guidelines on steriles on aseptic manufacture had this, as way back as 2004. Various pharmacopoeias have included this for a long time, and even kind of ISO regulations, so the ones around clean room design and clean room monitoring, so that's ISO 14644, so my memory's still working, have said that there's a need to do it. There's a need for you to monitor what's going on in your clean rooms, to look at that interaction between people, equipment, and the room that it's in, and the product that you're making at the end of the day. So there's a lot of regulations there. I think what has really brought it to the forefront, certainly in the past couple of years, is the change and the issue of Annex 1 actually coming out, and having now really some more structured guidance, some specifics as to what license holders, what manufacturers or CDMOs really need to do when they're looking at airflow and patterns within a facility. To me, kind of the three key things that you're really looking for as part of that, and what the guidelines really say you should be looking for, is that your airflow patterns they're visualized. You're very much looking at what your air is doing, and whether you've got any ingress from a lower grade area to a higher grade, or whether you've got movement, a reversal in the wrong direction. So for example, we talk about classifications, EU GMP classifications. Our grade A, which tends to be our aseptic core, we don't want air coming from a dirtier environment, from a grade B, a grade C environment, moving into that core where our actual product is itself. We also want to make sure that where the airflow movement is shown to be poor, or it's shown to be slow, or it's not shown to be doing the right thing, that we're actually taking that into consideration. We're not just doing the video and not doing anything about it. We're looking at what that may mean in terms of a contamination risk, and what it may mean to the patient at the actual end of it. And we try to work out ways to minimize that, to eliminate it, to design it out in some way, shape or form. And I think the final thing is actually holding on to this work that you've actually done in the first place. We often, in a world where we say, if it's not documented, it doesn't happen, in effect. And that's very much kind of the case with airflow visualization. We've got a documented, a digital, a video record of what's gone on, and we need to retain that. We need to have some explanation and report that goes with that says, not only did we do it, but this is what we actually did with it, and this is how we moved that and understood that and took it forward into our contamination control strategy to make sure that we were doing the right thing, both for the patient, the product, and how we operate. So I've talked about the regulations, I've talked about kind of very much the why we're doing it, but what are some of the common findings that people come across? And that's not just inspectors, it's as me, because I kind of sit on both sides of doing smoke and airflow visualization. So I've done it, I've walked the walk, I've done the testing, but equally I've reviewed some as well, good and bad. So quite often I'm brought in to look at those and review those kind of studies or the works that's actually been done. So the sorts of things I tend to find is that, well, the principal one is not all of the studies have been done. So, a smoke visualization and airflow visualization has not been done in the first place. When it has been done, perhaps the wrong equipment has been used. I think I use the term sometimes using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So sometimes the smoke generator that's used or the actual lance or distribution system can be far too big, so there's far too much smoke, which means you can't actually visualize what's going on. You essentially get a video full of smoke. Sometimes it's not representative of what's going on in the area as well. So part of smoke visualization is not just having an empty room or an empty piece of equipment and actually filling it full of smoke. It's actually about mimicking or simulating what's going on in that environment and showing what happens to the airflow when there's an interaction. Now that interaction could be a person, it could be a door opening on a piece of equipment, it could be a door opening to the room. But the visualization itself is as much about what's happening during operations or in a typical manufacturing environment as it is when it's kind of static and no one's actually in the room itself. So that's kind of something else as well. The way the studies can be set up quite often is not necessarily structured and planned. So it's very much go into a room, I'll pass some smoke around, and then we'll figure out what to do afterwards, rather than actually saying, well, we should look at the inlets, we should look at the extracts, we should look at where equipment is positioned, we should look where perhaps there might be kind of dead spots or where people are entering and exiting from a room, or where they're even having to kind of change over a process, where they're actually having to go into the critical zone or the aseptic core to actually make what we would call like an intervention. And that is somewhere where very much there's a risk of contamination happening. So we want to see what's actually happening to the airflow around them, whether we're still actually getting that good unidirectional airflow, whether the principles of something called first air principle are being kind of obeyed as well. Because very much when you get into a clean environment, into your grade A, really it can only really be grade A in some ways, if that air is not kind of coming into contact with anything else, not least people. So we want that air to come into contact with nothing else when it's absolutely clean, when it's sterile, other than kind of washing over and flushing kind of the product, in a sense, to keep it clean, to keep that contamination away. Other things I've seen, and I think other findings tend to be around cameras being obstructed. People actually, I don't think it's necessarily they want their 15 minutes of fame, but their arm might, or they might actually get into the shot. Also actually being kind of appropriately gowned or, in the correct PPE for the environment that you're in. Remembering that, the person doing the airflow visualization is much a part of the test as the people that are actually in the forefront or in the foreground of the work as well. I see a lot of the video, the work being done, the smoke visualizations being done, but not actually having, any instructions or procedure to do it for people actually being trained in it. It can be quite ad hoc or done as you go along. Rather than being structured and in some sort of plan or protocol. And then there's the flip side of that, of it actually not having an output from it, not having something tangible in terms of an actual report itself, because that will feed into what you do next. That will feed into your environmental monitoring strategy or your contamination control strategy for your facility. So we want all of those things, really to kind of summarize that. We also want to make sure that violations kind of in the area kind of not picked up, so we shouldn't be doing that to say, look what happens if I do this, or having pools of water on the floor or people who are not correctly gowned. It's very much meant to be a representation of how we operate this facility and how we're doing everything possible to minimize contamination at the end of the day in order to give safe products for the patients and the people that are actually taking them. So let's start off with the do's. What do you want to do when you're actually setting up for a smoke visualization study? You want to use the correct equipment. We've probably heard that as I've gone along. Having the right equipment, having the right way to kind of introduce your smoke medium, and making sure you're doing that in the right way so that the airflow is showing you what the smoke is doing rather than the smoke is kind of key. Also, doing things that might not seem so obvious at the time but are key to you understanding what's happening in your area. So that can be opening and closing doors. Sometimes I've had people kind of say to me, but why should we open and close doors? Why should we look at that? Well, because you're going to be going in and out of doors, you're going to be bringing in materials, you're going to be taking out waste, and we need to see what happens to the airflows in the environment when you do that. Having the right people to kind of support in there. So don't just have the person that's actually doing the smoke testing themselves. It should be a collective, it should be a team activity where the likes of a quality assurance is involved, a microbiologist is involved, because they're going to use this information to set up some sort of environmental monitoring routine. You might want your engineers there, because there might be things that they pick up from the HVAC, the heating, the ventilation and air conditioning itself that are going on, the setup of the room and how it's laid out that can actually be changed, could be modified to actually make things better, that could minimize contamination. And also the operators to understand how what they are doing influences what goes on in the room. You want to make the recordings as clear as possible. Having too much smoke, it is very much a balance. These recordings are meant to be able to be picked up in a week, in 6 months' time, in 6 years' time, in order for an inspector or an auditor or anyone else to understand what's going on in a particular environment, whether that be a room, a piece of equipment, or anything else. So the clearer you can make these, the more understanding they're going to get of your processing and what's going on, and that you're actually maintaining control of it. Another thing to do is really from the outset is to identify what you're going to do, the scope of what you're going to do in the first place, rather than just saying, today I'm going to do a smoke visualization study and just taking the equipment in. So mapping out the area, having an understanding of what goes on in that area, how it's set up, where your inlets are, where your extracts are, where the entry and exit points are all good things for you to kind of have to build up a plan of where you think you will want to monitor, where you think you will want to introduce the smoke, and actually record what's going on. Do the airflow visualization study as soon as possible. I've seen lots of clients and customers that have kind of come to me and have said, I've got to the end of my project, I've got this new facility, it's all shiny and new, we need to do some airflow visualization studies. Well, you probably should have contacted me about 6 to 12 months ago when you started the journey to kind of do that, rather than now. So the sooner you can start it, the better. Even at the design stage, to say, what do we need to consider in this by the time we actually come to actually carry out an airflow visualization study. There might be other elements that actually feed into that as well. So something I always kind of recommend to clients and to bring to the forefront is something called CFD, so computational fluid dynamics. That actually gives some of that foresight of actually what's going to go on in your environment before the facility's even built. We can look at models actually of the facility in terms of what's going to go on with airflow, what's going to happen when equipment is introduced into that, and when people are actually put into that mix as well. So they're all good things to have, but the key is kind of planning and preparation and doing it as soon as you can, not leaving it to the last minute. Here's my guide, if you like, as to what you shouldn't be doing. So the obvious thing is kind of displaying poor behaviours. I think I've said before that the way you kind of structure your facility, the way that you're operating in it, and certainly the way you're going to carry out that smoke or that airflow visualization testing, it's indicative. It's making a representation of how you're going to operate it normally. So it should very much kind of reflect those good manufacturing practice behaviours that we all know and love. So having your facility set up correctly, having people gowned in the correct way for the environment, very much having those, not having people wandering around with jewellery on, with mobile phones in their hands, or generally having things like water on the floor, having things that are kind of quite clear GMP violations, that show an area might not be in control. Using too much or too little smoke, I think, as I've already said, remembering that the video should very much kind of be doing the talking from a visual point of view. So trying to see, actually what you're trying to visualize in the first place is kind of key. We're trying to see what's going on with the airflow in a clean room environment. We're not putting on a music video or a music concert. Otherwise it'd be called something quite different. Another thing I think I've seen and I would recommend people not do is really just passing smoke around a room at kind of one height, bearing in mind that we've got this entire room to look at that we can sample. It's the ultimate sample in effect, because we're not restricted on how we sample for a airflow visualization. We should be doing things at different heights in different areas of the room rather than concentrating just at the working height. So we should be doing things at a high level, we should be doing them at a medium level, but we should also be looking at low levels as well, because we've got things like furniture and tables actually in the rooms where we might have work actually taking place, as well as these equipment as well. And we want to see what the airflow or the air currents are actually doing around that as well, not just in the open room or the open environment itself. Not having a procedure to go by tends to be another no-no. People need to understand why they're doing what they're doing at the end of the day. They also need to know that the area they're walking into is actually suitable to do some airflow visualization testing in the first place. So making sure, as I would call it, prerequisites, certain things are in place before you go in, tend to be quite key. So is my air conditioning working properly? Have I got any alarms actually going off in the area? Has it been maintained? Are all things we should actually be looking at before we go in, so that we know we're being set up or we're ready to succeed in actually doing an airflow visualization or a smoke test, rather than going in and going on a voyage of discovery. A few more things on kind of the don'ts, the do nots, if you like, of an airflow visualization study. I've come along quite often or dealt with clients before where they've done all of this great work. They've done a great smoke visualization study. I've got a report to go by, and then I found that actually what's in the report and the layout of how the room was done, for example, doesn't match how the room is that they're operating. So it's changed. So the key word, like for me there, is changing the room, and it doesn't reflect what's actually being done in terms of a smoke or an airflow visualization test. So don't change your room. If you're going to change a room, or you're going to change things within it, or you're going to change how you operate it, bear that in mind, because there's an expectation to actually look at your airflow visualization again, and to make sure that it's not changed the dynamics, that it's not changed any potential source of contamination being introduced into the room and into your product and potentially into the patient. We want to make sure that there's actually a protocol in place. We want to make sure there's a document that kind of structures our strategy and how we're actually planning on approaching this. And that should cover everything from how people are trained to do it in the first place, the scope of the area that we're looking at. We should have drawings of what we're actually looking at as well, because the videos are only really as good as being able to kind of relate those back to a drawing, a map of kind of what you're looking at. Bearing in mind, when they're inspected, when they're audited or reviewed, they're quite often reviewed as part of a package. So being able to relate that video, that part of a study, to a document, to a map, just makes things all that much more kind of clearer in terms of you explaining why good looks good or why it looks bad in this instance. So make sure it's documented in that way. And you should be looking for certain aspects before you start. You should be looking at the status of your heating, your ventilation and air conditioning. Filters should have been integrity tested. The facility should be running as it should be. There shouldn't be alarms in the area, but if there are, you should be recording those as part of your package, so that if you do see something that's kind of atypical or is not usual, you've actually got some reasoning why, rather than you thinking it might be based on what's actually going on in the room or the people that's actually or actually involved in the first place. Record the setup of the room in there. This is key. I think I've said previously in my kind of not to do's, about changing the room. You very much are taking a snapshot of what's gone on in that room at the time. So you want to understand where things were positioned, whether a cabinet was positioned in the right hand corner or the left hand corner, whether doors were open, closed. It could be all of those things. So make sure the setup of your room is captured in that way. Having appropriately trained people is another thing to document down. It's all very well and good letting people go away and do this kind of exercise, but you want to show that there's a training process, that people understand what they're doing and why they're actually doing it in terms of an airflow visualization test, in order to get out of it what they need. Probably the next thing I'm going to say is probably a little bit of a 2-point thing. So in terms of actually documenting it, you obviously want to make conclusions about what you've seen about the airflow, about the description of it and what's going on, because the video will tell you one thing, but you're wanting to be able to interpret that as well, and understand what you're going to do about it as kind of an output. But the kind of second point I want to make about that is that it shouldn't be left to that point of kind of documenting it. People should kind of be present at the time there in the room when you're doing these studies to be able to document it as well. It shouldn't be left to kind of some time later to understand what the output of those videos or those recordings are. And really the main reason for that is you might see things at the time that the camera doesn't necessarily pick up on, or that the recording doesn't pick up on. It could be a different angle that you need. It could be doing a re-recording because perhaps there was something in the room that wasn't typical at the time. So having people there at the time of you doing the study to document what's going on and capturing that in your airflow visualization protocol is a good thing to do. It's a good thing to document. So you've got that history, you've got that timeline of what went on, and then wrapping that all together and bringing it together at the end to say what you did with that as an output. Your videos have always got to be available. So actually kind of having traceability of those, labeling those, making sure you've got structure. So I can pull a video from room 1 or room 3 or room 5B is key to being able to be prepared and actually present these in an environment where you need to, or just being able to find them so that you can actually look at those and review how you're going to factor those in to your contamination control strategy or into your environmental monitoring. We're in a day and age these days where kind of the recordings of these, are not just resided to actually being on physical media anymore. So once upon a time, we might have had these just on flash drives or hard disks itself. Now, a lot of these can tend to be backed up as well and readily shared, so that we've actually got a library of airflow visualizations as well. And that's something that's good. It helps to, businesses, clients to build up this kind of repository of information, this library of technical information of what's going on in their areas and in their facilities, and can be a really powerful tool in terms of training their employees, really, particularly the operators that are going to work in that environment, to show them what the kind of the results of their actions may be, how what they do makes a difference in terms of product and patient at the end of the day. Right at the start of this, I think I had mentioned that that product, that patient interaction, by the actions that we're doing, by us actually recording what's happening here, we're trying to prevent contamination getting into our products and potentially harming a patient. So we have to do something with this information. We're duty bound to do something with it. And what we're wanting to do with it in this case is we're wanting to link it into our contamination control strategy, because that really gives a clear strategy as to what's going on in the facility, how we're managing it, and what we're going to do to minimize risk and risk to a patient at the end of the day. So we're taking all of those outputs to help build in contamination control is one thing, but we're also building up this package or this body of knowledge, and that knowledge can be used for numerous things. It could be for the setup of the facility, it could be for a changeover, it could be for training our actual operators that are working in that environment to work in a good aseptic way. So it's about more than kind of just having the airflow visualization. It's all the sum total of the outputs that you're getting out of it. It has multiple benefits in terms of this work and this package of work that we're actually putting together. During kind of that exercise, or during the exercise of you even planning, airflow visualization, people should be starting to get into the mindset of pulling together this contamination control strategy, because it can be quite a large body of work and of evidence to say, well, what influences that? Is it my people? Is it my equipment? Is it my materials? Is it those actual kind of dynamics of people going in and out of the facility, and how I've designed it in the first place? So all of those elements are in a way a bit of a jigsaw to how your contamination control strategy is put together, but there's a lot of those pieces that are influenced by what you do in the airflow visualization studies that I'm talking about. The correct kind of way of doing airflow visualization studies can be a massively beneficial tool. It's going to help you to understand your risks, help you to mitigate them, but we have to remember at the end of it that they're no excuse for validating bad practice, for doing something in a bad way. They're going to show you the good as well as the bad, but that doesn't mean we can justify doing the bad because we've taken a video, we've done smoke visualization on it. There will inevitably be things that you kind of have to look at, that you have to review and say, actually, is that a contamination risk? Have I got a risk to my product, to my patient? And it may mean you going back and designing or redesigning part of your facility. It may mean you going back and changing the way you actually do a process, but that's all part of that kind of journey. So it's good practice to actually define what you're doing, from an early stage with your airflow visualization process, to have that link, to have the people actually involved that are going to have the knowledge and the insight to actually do something with the output of that. I'd probably say plan and prepare. I think I've said that quite often. You know, it's only as good as the planning and preparation, like most things that you put into smoke and airflow visualization testing. Have a clear understanding of what you're kind of setting out to achieve in the first place, and make sure you kind of agree on that and have that written down somewhere. Understand the equipment and the methods that you're actually using. Don't do that scenario of using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You know, not all smoke systems and distribution systems are the same. Sometimes we need smaller ways or smaller ways of actually introducing smoke. Sometimes we're doing larger rooms and we do need to introduce larger volumes of smoke. So have that understanding of the tracer particle method that I talked about earlier on in your mind. That's one of the key things. Your testing methods and what you're actually looking for in terms of a clear sort of acceptance criteria should be set out, rather than saying it's good airflow. We should be saying, do we get reversals? Do we get static airflow? All of those things to allow people to make a good judgment on what good looks like in the first place. Documenting the exercise, as I think I've said, you know, the videos alone aren't enough. You kind of got to have this overall kind of document, this report to kind of convey, you know, to whoever's looking at it, what you set out to achieve, you know, why it's right, what you've done with that information in terms of putting that and linking it into your contamination control strategy. And that's probably the final thing, is just link it to your contamination control strategy. Don't forget to do that. And that's probably about it from me, but I wish you all the best of luck with your airflow visualization testing, and contact me if you need any more info.
Gavin Wadsworth there. Thank you, Gavin, for sharing your expert knowledge of airflow visualization for delivering knowledge. You can also check out Gavin's views on the future of environmental monitoring on our website and YouTube channel. If you're an expert in your field and would like to work with us to create a Delivering Knowledge video, we'd love to hear from you. Delivering Knowledge, our non-commercial initiative to share insights, experience and expertise from across the industry.